Part 1. The Shattered Illusion. I once thought I had the perfect marriage. 10 years together, Mark had always been the ideal husband, a devoted father to our son, a gentle, caring man who never gave me a reason to doubt him. We had an 8-year-old son, a small but happy family. My life seemed complete, flawless, until that day. That day was our son's birthday, a special day. I had prepared everything perfectly: the cake, the gifts, his favorite foods, and a house full of guests. The air was filled with laughter and joy. Mark was the same as always. He laughed a lot, played with our son, greeted the guests. Looking at him, I felt lucky to have such a husband. But then something unimaginable happened. The doorbell rang. I didn't think much of it. Just another guest arriving late. But when I opened the door, my heart stopped. A young boy stood there, about 9 years old. Bright eyes, but the most shocking thing, he looked exactly like Mark. Before I could react, the boy ran inside, looked at Mark, and shouted, "Daddy!" The room fell silent. Everyone stopped. I felt the blood in my veins freeze. I turned to Mark, waiting for an explanation, but his face, pale as a ghost. He couldn't utter a single word. Then, a woman stepped inside. Her eyes were unwavering. She looked straight at Mark and spoke with a firm voice. "You can't run from this anymore, Mark. Tell your wife the truth." In that moment, my world collapsed. The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. A strange boy, a child who looked eerily like Mark, had just called him Daddy. Every guest in the room held their breath. Their eyes flickered between the boy and my husband, but the only person I could see was Mark. He stood there, motionless, as if every drop of blood had drained from his body. I waited. I needed him to say something, but Mark said nothing. Before I could speak, the woman stepped forward. Her long, wavy hair framed a sharp, determined face. She folded her arms and uttered the words that shattered my world. "You can't run from this anymore, Mark. Tell your wife the truth." The air turned to ice. I turned to Mark once more, waiting. But my husband remained silent. He didn't deny it. He didn't fight back. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I looked at the boy, the 9-year-old standing there, his innocent eyes reflecting no guilt. Yet he was undeniable proof of a betrayal I had never imagined. I took a deep breath, my voice trembling but clear. "This child, is he yours?" Mark lowered his head, his fists clenched tightly. I could see his chest rising and falling rapidly, his breath unsteady. And then his voice cracked as he whispered, "I'm sorry, but yes, he's my son." I felt my heart shatter into pieces. The room erupted in hushed whispers. Every eye in the house was now on me, the wife who had been deceived for 10 years without knowing it. The woman stepped closer, her tone cold but not angry. "How long were you planning to hide us, Mark?" I stayed silent for 9 years, but today I refused to be ignored any longer. I was stunned. She knew about me, but I had never known about her. And then, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Mark had betrayed me even before we got married. I couldn't breathe. The air around me felt thick, suffocating. "I'm sorry, but yes, he's my son." Mark's words echoed in my head like a nightmare on repeat. I wanted to scream, to fight, to deny everything. But the truth was staring me in the face. I had been living a lie for 10 years. The guests in the room were still watching, but I no longer cared about them. I only cared about Mark, the man I had trusted, loved, and built a life with. And yet, the woman beside him folded her arms, her expression unapologetic. She looked at me, then at Mark, her voice laced with bitterness. "Did you really think you could keep this a secret forever? I stayed silent for 9 years. But today, my son has the right to know who his father is." I shivered. 9 years. Mark and I had been married for 10, which meant... A bitter, hollow laugh escaped my lips. He had betrayed me before I even walked down the aisle. I turned to Mark, my voice cracking. "When did you start cheating on me?" He lowered his head, unable to meet my gaze. I already knew the answer. She knew about me, knew Mark was married, but I had never known about her, not even a hint. I looked at the boy, the son of Mark, and this woman. His round eyes were filled with confusion, but he wasn't to blame. He was innocent, but that didn't lessen my pain. I had been betrayed in the cruelest way. My chest tightened, but I had to face the truth. I clenched my fists, my voice trembling yet firm. "You hid this from me for 10 years. Don't tell me, in all that time you never saw her again?" Mark stayed silent. A chill ran through me. He had never stopped. It all became painfully clear. I had trusted this man. I had built a family with him, given him my love, my youth, and yet I was nothing more than a wife trapped in deception. I could feel anger boiling inside me. Pain, betrayal, everything mixed together, drowning me. I stared at Mark. He still wouldn't look at me. He knew. He had destroyed everything. The air in the room was suffocating. I took a deep breath, steadying my voice as much as I could. Choose. This family or her. My words hung in the silence. No one dared to speak. Mark clenched his fists. Finally, he lifted his head to look at me. Pain, hesitation, but also something else, something I didn't want to see. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to the woman. Just one look. But it was enough for me to understand everything. I had lost. Number Sagar. I had never even been in the running, because Mark had never truly chosen me. My breath caught as Mark stepped toward her. He took her hand, held it gently, and spoke in a soft but clear voice. "I'm sorry, but she is the one I truly love." Boom. It felt like an explosion inside my head. I had expected this answer, but hearing it broke me. 10 years of marriage, 10 years of trust, 10 years of love, all reduced to this one sentence. The room held its breath, waiting for my reaction. Should I cry? Scream? Hit Mark for his betrayal? I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. I smiled, a bitter, hollow smile. "Thank you for your answer." I turned around and walked away, not because I was weak, but because I knew I deserved better than this. I walked, step by step, out of that suffocating room. I didn't look back, not at Mark, not at the woman, not at the boy, the innocent child caught in the wreckage of Mark's lies. But at the door, I paused. One last thing needed to be said. I turned, my voice chillingly calm. "As of today, you are no longer my husband." Mark said nothing. He just stood there, empty-eyed, but I didn't care anymore. I was done. I looked at my son. He stood frozen, fear and confusion in his eyes. I took a deep breath, walked over, and pulled him into my arms. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," I whispered, "but we're starting a new life." And this time, I truly walked away. Out of the house I once called home. Out of the life of the man who had betrayed me for 10 years, out of a fabricated dream, toward the beginning of something new. But this wasn't the end, because this wasn't my downfall. This was the start of my next chapter. Next chapter. A woman who doesn't fall after walking away. I felt like I had escaped a nightmare. But the pain was still there. The sleepless nights, the shattered dreams, the moments I had to bite my lip to keep from crying in front of my son. But I refused to let myself break. I moved out of our old home and started a new life. I went back to work, pushing myself twice, no, 3 times, harder to ensure my son had a bright future. I was no longer the gentle, dependent wife. I was now a strong, independent, and determined woman. At first, people looked at me with pity. They whispered about me, about my broken marriage, about the woman who had taken my place. But I didn't care. I had something far more important to do: rebuild myself. Mark started to regret it. In the beginning, after I left, Mark seemed fine. He thought he had a new family, a life he had chosen. But things didn't turn out the way he expected. The woman he chose wasn't as kind or forgiving as I had been. She started controlling his life, demanding all his time and money for herself and their son. Meanwhile, my son, the child Mark had betrayed, began to drift away from him. He didn't want to see his father. He was angry. He ignored the calls, rejected the late gifts, because he knew his father had chosen someone else over his mother. Mark began to realize what he should have understood long ago. He had lost everything. He came looking for me. One late afternoon, as I was coming home from work, I saw Mark standing at my doorstep. He looked exhausted, his eyes filled with fatigue and desperation. "Can I come in?" he asked. I crossed my arms and looked at him, calm and unwavering. "For what?" My voice was colder than I expected. Mark swallowed hard. I just want to talk about you, about our son, about us." "Us?" I let out a small laugh. That word felt so empty coming from a man who had betrayed me. "Mark, there is no us anymore," I said. "You chose her. Now live with your choice." Mark shook his head, stepping forward, his eyes pleading. "I was wrong. I was completely wrong. I lost you. I lost our family. I regret it." His voice cracked. But I was no longer the weak woman I once was. I looked at him, without an ounce of sympathy. "Regret?" I repeated. "Mark, you had 10 years to think about that, and you chose to betray me. Now I'm no longer the woman who forgives just because of an apology." Mark's eyes turned red. He reached out, trying to take my hand, but I stepped back. "If you have any dignity left, leave me alone." Mark froze. I knew. He never expected me to be this strong. In the past, I was the wife who always gave in, who always prioritized the happiness of our family above all else. But now, I had learned to put myself first. I smiled, my voice soft but sharp. "Mark, you are my past, and I no longer live in the past." Then I turned around, walked inside, and shut the door in his face. I had completely closed the last chapter of my old life. Next chapter. The storm isn't over. I thought closing that door would be the end of it, that I had finally left my past behind. But life doesn't let you walk away so easily. Days passed, then weeks. I focused on my new life, my son, my career. I was no longer the woman who waited for someone to love her. I was my own hero now. But then, Mark came back, again and again. Each time he stood outside my door, looking more broken than before. "Please, just let me explain," he begged one night in the pouring rain. I sighed, stepping outside onto the porch. The cold raindrops hit my skin, but I didn't flinch. I had weathered a far greater storm than this. "There's nothing left to explain, Mark," I said, arms crossed. He ran a hand through his wet hair, his voice trembling. "You don't understand. She tricked me." I let out a short, bitter laugh. "She tricked you? Oh, that's rich. You chose her over me, over our son. Don't blame her now just because you regret it." Mark took a shaky breath. "She lied about the baby. She told me he wasn't mine at first. Then when I tried to leave, she told me he was." I stared at him, my stomach twisting. "So what? That changes nothing. You still betrayed me." Mark dropped his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know, and I'll never forgive myself. I should have felt satisfaction seeing him like this, but instead, I felt nothing. I had already grieved for this man, I had already suffered, I had already moved on, and I told him exactly that. Mark, your regrets are yours to bear, not mine. I stepped back inside and closed the door, this time, for good. But just as I thought the past was behind me, something happened that would change everything. A shocking revelation. One evening, as I was getting ready to pick up my son from school, my phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. "Hello?" I answered cautiously. A nervous breath on the other end. Then, a voice I hadn't heard since that night. Her. "Please don't hang up," she said. I nearly dropped my phone. "What the hell do you want?" My voice was sharper than a blade. I need to talk to you. It's about Mark," she said, her voice oddly shaky. I should have hung up. I should have walked away. But something in her tone, fear, desperation, made me hesitate. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her. The other woman's truth. She looked different than before. Gone was the confident, manipulative woman who had destroyed my marriage. Instead, the woman sitting across from me in the small coffee shop looked broken. Her hands trembled as she gripped her cup. I made a mistake, she whispered. I laughed, shaking my head. And why should I care? She swallowed hard. Because Mark is in trouble, and so am I. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. Not my problem. Tears welled in her eyes. You don't understand. The people I was involved with, they're dangerous. Mark, he didn't just cheat on you. He got caught up in something he can't get out of. My blood ran cold. What are you talking about? She took a deep breath, then said something that made my stomach drop. Mark owes people a lot of money. Dangerous people, and they're coming for him. The final test. I went home that night, my mind racing. Mark had betrayed me, lied to me, chosen someone else. But now, his life was in danger. I could have walked away, left him to his fate. But then, I looked at my son. Despite everything, Mark was still his father. And if something happened to him, my son would be the one left with a lifetime of pain. I had a choice to make. Would I save the man who had ruined me, or would I finally let him fall? Next chapter, a debt paid in blood. I barely slept that night. The weight of my decision pressed down on me like an anchor. Mark had ruined my life. He had broken my trust, humiliated me, and left me to pick up the pieces of a shattered marriage. But now, he was in danger, and no matter how much I hated him, if something happened to him, my son would suffer. I couldn't let that happen, so the next morning I made my choice. I was going to save Mark, but not for him, for my son. The meeting with the devil. I met her again, the woman who had destroyed my marriage. This time she was even worse off. Her hands trembled, dark circles hung under her eyes, and her voice was barely above a whisper. They gave Mark 1 week to pay, she said, glancing around nervously. If he doesn't, they'll make sure he never gets another chance. A sick feeling twisted in my stomach. How much does he owe? She bit her lip. 200,000. I nearly choked. You're joking. She shook her head. Mark thought he could make easy money. He gambled, got in too deep. When he couldn't pay, they gave him an opportunity, a loan, but they never expected him to repay it. They just wanted to own him. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I didn't have that kind of money, not even close. And even if I did, I wasn't about to pay for Mark's sins. There had to be another way. A desperate move. I needed to find Mark. When I finally tracked him down, he wasn't the man I used to know. He was a ghost of himself, his once confident, charming face now sunken and desperate. He looked at me with shock and shame when I walked into his apartment. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I crossed my arms. "I heard you got yourself into trouble." Mark's jaw clenched. "I'll handle it." I laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "Will you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're drowning." He exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair. "I never meant for this to happen." I slammed my fist on the table. "Mark, wake up! You didn't just screw yourself over, you dragged her into it too, and now these people are coming for you." Mark looked down. He was silent for a long moment before whispering, "I don't know what to do." I sighed. I had every reason to let him crash and burn, but I couldn't, because despite everything, I was stronger than him, and I refused to let my son grow up without a father. So I made a plan. The deal. I wasn't going to pay Mark's debt, but I knew someone who could help. I made a call to a lawyer I worked with, a woman who specialized in high-risk cases. She had seen it all, and she knew people. I explained the situation, and after a long silence, she finally said, "There's only one way out of this. You need leverage." Leverage. A way to turn the tables on the people Mark owed, and I knew exactly where to start. Into the lion's den. 2 days later, I walked into their world. A dimly lit club, music pounding through the walls, the air thick with smoke and money. I didn't belong here, but I didn't care. I spotted him almost instantly, the man Mark owed everything to, a powerful, dangerous man who thrived on fear. I took a deep breath and walked straight toward him. He looked up, his sharp eyes assessing me. "And who might you be?" I met his gaze without flinching. "The woman who's here to fix your problem." He leaned back, smirking. "Mark's ex-wife? I expected someone weaker." I smiled coldly. "Then you don't know me." For the first time, I wasn't the victim. I was in control, and I was about to change everything. The final play. I had done my research. These men didn't just lend money. They controlled people, and Mark wasn't the first desperate fool they had trapped. So I gave them an offer. "Mark can't pay you," I said. "But I know exactly how many others you've done this to. I know their names. I know the ones who are looking for a way out." The man's smile faded. I leaned forward. "Let him go. Erase his debt. Or I make sure everyone you own finds out how to break free." Silence. Then a slow, cruel chuckle. "You've got a lot of nerve," he said. "But I like that." He swirled his drink before looking at me again. "Fine, I'll let him go, but I expect you to keep your mouth shut." I smirked. "As long as you do the same." And just like that, it was done. The end of the road. Mark was free. But he wasn't saved. Because as I left that club, I knew one thing. He would never change. And I was done saving him. When I saw him later, his eyes filled with gratitude, I held up a hand. "Don't thank me," I said. "You're on your own now." Mark swallowed. "But," I shook my head, I didn't do this for you. I did this so my son doesn't grow up knowing his father was a failure." Mark looked like he wanted to argue, but then he saw it in my eyes. I was really, truly finished with him. I turned away and walked home, where my real life waited for me, where my son waited for me, where my future waited for me. Mark had been my past, and now he was nothing more than a lesson I had learned. A new beginning. I never saw Mark again after that night, but I never regretted saving him, not because he deserved it, but because I deserve to be the kind of woman who rises above the past. I built my life, my career, my future. I thrived. And in the end, I didn't just survive, I won. Thank you for watching. Your support means everything. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories. See you in the next video.